The church door slammed open just as the coffin was being lowered, and every head turned toward the trembling young woman standing beneath the rain. Her shoes were stained with mud from running half the county on foot, yet her own aunt looked at her with disgust and said, before the mourners and nobles alike, "You arrived late to your own mother's burial, because worthless daughters always do." The whispers spread instantly across the chapel. Some pitied her. Most enjoyed the humiliation. But the young woman didn't cry. She walked forward alone, while her relatives fought over jewelry, property papers, and even the lace covering her mother's coffin. And that was the moment the most feared duke in the kingdom stepped out from the last pew and asked a question nobody expected. Why is the only grieving child being treated like a servant? Silence swallowed the room so completely that even the priest lowered his head. Now, here is what I want you to think about carefully before we continue. Do you believe the Duke stepped forward because of kindness? Or do you think he already knew something shocking about her family long before that funeral began? Also, tell me in the comments which beautiful part of the world you are watching from, and ensure you subscribe because this funeral is only the beginning of what the kingdom is about to witness. Rain struck the chapel windows as Beatrice Whitcombe pushed through the crowded aisle with wet curls clinging to her face and grief tightening every breath in her chest. The burial prayers had already begun. Candles flickered beside her mother's coffin, while noble guests whispered behind gloved hands, staring at her as though she had committed some unforgivable crime by arriving late. Lady Millicent Whitcombe did not even wait for silence before speaking. "You shame your mother one final time," she announced coldly. Even in death, she could not depend on her own daughter. Several guests lowered their eyes in discomfort, yet none defended Beatrice. They had heard the rumors for years. The useless daughter, the burden of the Whitcombe family, the girl who brought no fortune, no connections, and no advantage to anyone around her. Beatrice swallowed hard and walked toward the coffin anyway. Her hands trembled when she touched the polished wood. Just yesterday, her mother had still been alive, weak from fever, yet smiling softly while brushing Beatrice's hair beside the window of their small chamber. Now strangers stood around discussing inheritance, while her mother rested in silence between flowers that already smelled of decay. "You should not touch it," Lady Millicent snapped. "Your mother's final weeks were miserable because of your constant presence." Beatrice slowly turned. "I cared for her when nobody else entered that room." Millicent's expression sharpened instantly. "Mind your tongue before witnesses." But Beatrice no longer feared her aunt's anger. Exhaustion had burned through that fear long ago. Across the chapel, Lord Percival Whitcombe adjusted his cuffs impatiently. He was Beatrice's older cousin and the new heir to the Whitcombe estate after her mother's death. His wife, Lenora, stood beside him with a satisfied little smile hidden beneath her mourning veil. "Really, cousin," Percival said loudly, "today is not the day for dramatics." The words tightened something painful inside her chest because she remembered another funeral years earlier when her father had been buried beneath the same grey sky. Percival had said nearly the same thing then, while quietly taking control of her father's businesses before the mourning period even ended. Some people did not wait for death to finish its work. The priest cleared his throat awkwardly and resumed the prayer. But attention had already shifted. The humiliation hanging over Beatrice felt heavier than the rain itself. Then the chapel doors opened again. Every whisper stopped at once. Duke Alistair Norwyn entered without announcement, his dark coat carrying droplets of rain across the stone floor, as two attendants remained behind him near the entrance. Nobody had expected the Duke to appear at such a small family funeral. Nobles immediately straightened their posture, while servants lowered their eyes. Beatrice had seen him only once before, from a distance during a royal parade in Belminster Square. Even then, people had spoken of him with caution. Some feared his silence more than another man's temper. The Duke's gaze moved calmly across the room before settling on Beatrice beside the coffin. Lady Millicent hurried forward with sudden sweetness in her voice. "Your Grace, what an unexpected honor." "I came to pay respect to Lady Helena Whitcombe," he replied evenly. Not once did he offer Millicent a smile. The old woman stiffened slightly before gesturing toward the front pews. "Please, sit beside the family." Alistair's eyes shifted toward Beatrice again. "I believe the family is standing already." The silence afterward felt almost dangerous. Percival quickly forced a laugh. "My cousin has always enjoyed attention, Your Grace. You must forgive the disturbance." Before Beatrice could speak, Lenora stepped closer and whispered harshly near her ear, "Do not embarrass us further. People already pity you enough." Pity. Beatrice hated that word more than cruelty itself. The priest resumed the service once more, though everyone remained distracted by the Duke's arrival. Even the servants exchanged nervous glances near the walls. As prayers continued, Beatrice noticed something strange. Duke Norwyn never once looked toward Percival or Millicent. Instead, his attention stayed fixed on her mother's coffin, as though remembering something private. When the burial ended, guests slowly began, moving outside toward the cemetery hill behind the chapel. Rain softened into a thin mist that drifted through the crooked graves and stone angels. Beatrice remained behind for one final moment beside the coffin. "You always told me not to bow before cruel people," she whispered shakily. "I tried, Mother. I truly tried." Her throat tightened painfully. Then another voice answered from behind her. "And did they reward your loyalty?" She turned sharply. Duke Norwyn stood near the chapel doors alone. Beatrice lowered her eyes immediately. "Your Grace, you cared for your mother, personally?" "Yes." "Until the end?" "Yes." He studied her quietly. "Interesting." She frowned slightly. "I do not understand." "I imagine there are many things inside this family you do not understand yet." Before she could ask what he meant, footsteps interrupted them. Millicent entered briskly with Percival and Lenora close behind. The older woman's smile returned instantly when facing the Duke. "We are preparing refreshments at Whitcombe Manor," she announced. "Surely your Grace would honor us with your presence." "I will attend briefly," Alistair answered. Millicent looked relieved, but then the Duke added calmly, "Miss Whitcombe will ride with me." The air inside the chapel froze. Lenora's mouth parted in disbelief, while Percival nearly dropped his gloves. Millicent recovered first. "Surely that is unnecessary. Beatrice can return with servants." "I did not ask whether it was necessary." His tone remained polite, which somehow made it more terrifying. Beatrice herself stood speechless. Why would a duke insist on escorting the woman everyone else dismissed as worthless? Percival stepped forward carefully. "Your Grace, perhaps you are unaware that my cousin is not accustomed to noble society." Alistair finally looked at him directly. "And perhaps you are unaware that I did not request your opinion." The humiliation on Percival's face was immediate. Beatrice almost pitied him. Almost. Outside, rainwater rolled across the carriage windows as the Duke's coach travelled toward Whitcombe Manor. Beatrice sat stiffly across from him, unsure where to place her hands or eyes. "You are frightened," Alistair observed quietly. "I am confused." "That is reasonable." She gathered courage slowly. "Why did you come today?" "To honor a debt." Her brows pulled together. My mother knew you. Yes. The answer came too quickly to be accidental. Beatrice searched his expression desperately for clues, but the Duke revealed nothing beyond controlled calm. My mother never spoke of you, she admitted softly. She would not have. The carriage fell silent again, until Beatrice finally whispered, "Everyone thinks I am worthless." Alistair's gaze lifted toward her fully for the first time. "And what do you think?" No one had ever asked her that before. Not once. Beatrice looked down at her worn gloves. "I think people decide a woman's value before hearing her speak." For the first time, something shifted in the Duke's expression. Not amusement, not pity, recognition. When the carriage reached Whitcombe Manor, servants rushed outside carrying lanterns against the fading evening mist. The estate looked grand from afar, yet Beatrice knew too well how rotten its walls truly were. Inside the drawing room, nobles gathered around silver trays while discussing inheritance, titles, and property transfers with shocking ease for people who had just attended a funeral. Lady Millicent approached immediately. "Beatrice, you will remain silent tonight," she warned under her breath. "One more embarrassment, and you will leave this house permanently." Before Beatrice could answer, a servant entered hurriedly from the corridor. "Your Grace," the servant announced nervously, "a royal messenger has arrived from the palace." Every conversation stopped. The messenger entered, carrying sealed parchment marked with the royal crest itself. He bowed deeply before Duke Norwyn. "His Majesty requests your immediate appearance tomorrow morning regarding the selection ceremony." The room erupted into whispers. Everyone in the kingdom knew about the royal selection ceremony. After years without choosing a duchess, Duke Norwyn had finally been commanded by the crown to present a future bride before the royal court. Lenora laughed softly with excitement. "Half the unmarried ladies in Belminster will faint before sunrise." But the messenger was not finished. "There is one more instruction from the palace," he continued carefully. "His Majesty specifically requests that the lady accompanying your Grace tonight must also attend." Silence crashed through the room. Every face turned slowly toward Beatrice. And across the drawing room, Lady Millicent's wine glass slipped from her fingers and shattered across the floor. The shattered glass on the drawing room floor still gleamed when silence finally broke into whispers that spread like wind through an open hall. Beatrice stood frozen where she had been placed by circumstance rather than choice, her fingers slowly curling into her palms as every noble eye in the room shifted toward her with disbelief that quickly turned into judgment. Lady Millicent recovered first, her voice sharp but controlled. "This must be a mistake," she said quickly. "Our family has no connection to such royal matters." The messenger did not look at her. His attention remained fixed on Duke Alistair Norwyn, as though only one person in the room mattered. "The instruction came directly under the royal seal," he repeated. "There is no mistake." Percival stepped forward, trying to hide the strain in his expression. "Your Grace, surely this is a misunderstanding. My cousin is not trained for court appearances. She has lived quietly, without preparation for such matters." Alistair did not respond immediately. Instead, his gaze moved once again to Beatrice, steady and unreadable. "That is precisely why she will attend," he said at last. A murmur swept through the room. Beatrice felt her throat tighten. "I do not understand," she said quietly. "I have done nothing to be chosen for anything." The Duke's expression softened just slightly, though his voice remained firm. "Then perhaps it is time you begin to understand what others have hidden from you." Lady Millicent's hand tightened around her fan. "Your Grace, this is improper." She is grieving, exhausted, and unprepared. And yet, Alistair replied calmly, she is the only person in this room whose presence has been specifically requested by the Crown. That sentence silenced even the most confident voices in the room. Lenora leaned closer to Percival, whispering urgently, "This will ruin everything if she is seen at court." Percival did not answer, but his eyes darkened as they fixed on Beatrice. Beatrice herself could feel the weight of the room pressing into her shoulders. Nothing in her life had ever placed her at the center of attention like this. Even during her father's funeral, she had been invisible beside the louder ambitions of others. Now, every breath she took seemed to echo. The messenger stepped back after delivering the sealed parchment, signaling that his duty was complete. Before leaving, he added one final line. The selection ceremony begins in 7 days. All required participants must be present in Belminster Palace by then. And then he was gone. The sound of his departure felt louder than his arrival. Lady Millicent immediately turned toward Beatrice. "You will refuse," she ordered sharply under her breath. Beatrice blinked at her. "I cannot refuse something I do not understand." "You will refuse," Millicent repeated, stepping closer. "Do you think court life will show you kindness? You will embarrass this family beyond repair." Beatrice's voice lowered. "This family has not protected me from embarrassment before." A flicker of anger crossed Millicent's face, but before she could respond, Duke Alistair stepped forward. "You will not speak to her in that manner again," he said. His tone was quiet, but it carried a weight that cut through every layer of authority in the room. Millicent stiffened. "Your Grace, she is under my guardianship." "No," he replied simply. "She is not." The words landed like a final decision, rather than an argument. Beatrice looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Alistair turned slightly toward her, as though deciding how much truth to reveal in a single breath. "Your mother left instructions before her passing," he said. "Legal ones. You are not bound to this household in the way they believe." Percival's face changed instantly. "That is impossible." "It is recorded," the Duke replied. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Beatrice's heart beat faster now, not from fear alone, but from confusion that finally had direction. "My mother left instructions?" "Yes." Millicent's composure cracked slightly. "This is nonsense. She was ill and overwhelmed. She would not have made such arrangements without informing me." Alistair's eyes narrowed slightly. "She did not inform you because she did not trust you." The words struck the room harder than any accusation. Beatrice felt something shift inside her chest. Her mother had always been gentle, patient, even when illness made her weak. The idea that she had made hidden arrangements suggested a life of decisions. Beatrice had never been allowed to see. "Why would she do that?" Beatrice asked softly. The Duke studied her carefully before answering. "Because she believed your safety depended on it." A hush followed that answer, deeper than before. Lenora laughed nervously. "Safety? From what?" No one answered her. Instead, Alistair gestured slightly toward the door. "We will leave for Belminster within 2 days." Beatrice took a small step back. "I have not agreed to any of this." "You do not need to agree," he said. "You only need to survive it." That sentence lingered in the air long after he stopped speaking. Later that evening, the manor slowly emptied of guests who had come for mourning, but stayed for spectacle. Conversations outside the drawing room carried quickly through corridors, servants repeating fragments of what they had overheard. Beatrice found herself alone near the corridor window, overlooking the estate grounds. The mist outside had thickened slightly, blurring the shape of the distant hedges. Footsteps approached behind her. She did not turn immediately. "You are being watched more closely than you realize." Alistair said. Beatrice finally turned. Why me? The question had followed her since the chapel, growing heavier with every passing hour. The Duke paused, as though choosing honesty carefully. Because your mother's name appears in records connected to the royal court, he said. Records that were sealed years ago. Beatrice frowned. My mother was a quiet woman. She never attended court. That is what was believed, he replied. But belief is not always truth. A silence settled between them. Beatrice searched his face for certainty, but found only controlled patience. If I go to this selection, she said slowly, what will happen to me? Alistair's gaze remained steady. People will try to define you before you speak. Some will want to use you. Others will want to remove you from the process entirely. And you? For the first time, a faint shift appeared in his expression. I intend to ensure neither succeeds. The honesty of it unsettled her more than deception would have. Beatrice looked away briefly, trying to steady her thoughts. I am still the girl they called worthless this morning. That, he said quietly, is exactly why the court will not know what to do with you. She turned back. And you do oppose? No, he admitted, but I intend to learn. That answer should have frightened her more than it did. Instead, it left her strangely still. The following morning brought no peace. Servants moved through Whitcombe Manor, preparing rooms for departure, while Lady Millicent remained locked in private discussions with Percival. Beatrice could hear their voices at intervals through the walls, sharp and urgent. At one point, Lenora entered Beatrice's chamber without knocking. You will fail, she said immediately. Beatrice looked up from the small bundle she had been given for travel. I have not even begun. That is worse, Lenora replied. At least failure requires effort. You will be destroyed simply by standing there. Beatrice studied her calmly. Then, why are you so afraid of me going? Lenora hesitated for a fraction of a second, too long. Because you do not belong there, she finally said, then turned and left. Beatrice remained seated, the words lingering longer than intended. When the carriage arrived, 2 days later, the estate gathered once more. This time, not for mourning, but for departure under watchful uncertainty. Lady Millicent approached Beatrice one final time before she stepped outside. If you disgrace this family, she said softly, you will never be allowed back. Beatrice met her gaze. I was never truly allowed in. The carriage door closed before any reply could follow. As wheels began to turn, Duke Alistair Norwyn's voice came quietly from across the seat. You will see soon enough, he said, why your presence cannot be ignored. And as Whitcombe Manor slowly disappeared behind the mist-covered road, Beatrice Whitcombe began her journey toward a court that already knew her name, even if she did not know why. The carriage wheels cut through the misted road toward Belminster Palace, and Beatrice sat rigidly inside, as the world she knew slowly disappeared behind them. Every mile felt like a silent decision being made without her permission, as if her life had already been placed on a table and examined by unseen hands. Duke Alistair Norwyn sat opposite her, unreadable as ever, watching not the road but her face, as though measuring how she would break under pressure that had not yet fully arrived. You are thinking too loudly, he said at last. Beatrice blinked. I am trying to understand why my life has been pulled into something I never asked for. That is not how the court works, he replied calmly. It rarely asks before it changes a person's fate. She looked out of the window. Then I suppose I should expect nothing of my own choice anymore. That would be unwise, he said. You still have choices. You just have fewer than before. The carriage slowed as they approached the palace gates. Massive stone pillars rose into the grey sky and guards stepped forward to inspect the arriving seal. The atmosphere changed instantly, becoming heavier, more controlled, as if even the air obeyed rules here. Beatrice felt it immediately. This place was not like Whitcombe Manor. It was not even like the chapel where she had been humiliated. This was something else entirely, a place where silence itself seemed to have authority. The gates opened. Inside, the palace courtyard stretched wide with trimmed paths, symmetrical gardens, and polished stone walkways. Nobles stood in small groups, their conversations pausing the moment the Duke's carriage entered. Whispers followed instantly. That is him. He has returned early. And who is that woman with him? Beatrice heard every word clearly, even through the closed carriage. The carriage stopped. A servant stepped forward and opened the door. Duke Alistair exited first, then turned and offered no hand, only a simple gesture for her to follow. Beatrice stepped down carefully, immediately feeling the weight of dozens of eyes settle on her like judgment, waiting for confirmation. A woman near the palace steps leaned toward another and whispered, "She looks nothing like the others expected." Another replied, "That is either a mistake or a message." Beatrice kept her gaze forward, though her heartbeat had already quickened. Alistair walked beside her without speaking as they moved toward the main hall. Inside, the palace corridors were lined with portraits of former rulers and noble families. Every face seemed to watch her passing, as if even history itself was evaluating her presence. "You will be brought to your assigned quarters," the Duke said quietly. "Until the selection begins, you will remain within palace grounds." "And after the selection?" she asked. "That depends on what the court decides you are." The words unsettled her more than anything else so far. They reached a large chamber where attendants waited. One bowed quickly before speaking. He said, "Your Grace, the council has already gathered in preparation for tomorrow's review of candidates." "Good," Alistair replied. "Then they will see her early." Beatrice turned slightly toward him. "They will see me as what?" He paused. "That is no longer entirely in my control." She was led to a smaller chamber within the guest wing. The room was elegant, but cold, prepared for someone who belonged to a world she did not recognize. As servants placed her belongings down, she noticed how carefully they avoided her eyes. Once alone, she sat near the window and looked out at the vast palace gardens below. Everything here felt structured, controlled, and distant. A knock interrupted her thoughts. A young attendant entered. "Miss Whitcombe, the council requests your presence in the lower hall." Already, she had not even been allowed to settle. When she arrived, several nobles stood waiting. Among them was Lord Harrowen, a man known for his influence in court selection matters. His gaze was sharp, assessing her without politeness. "So," he said, "this is the unexpected participant." Beatrice remained silent. Another noblewoman stepped forward. "She does not even speak confidently. How is she meant to stand aside a duke?" Whispers followed again. Alistair appeared behind her without announcement. "This meeting was not requested for judgment," he said firmly. Lord Harrowen smiled slightly. "Everything in court is judgment, Your Grace." A tense silence followed. Beatrice finally spoke. "If I am here against expectation, then I would like to know why." All eyes shifted toward her. Harrowen studied her more closely now. Bold question for someone untrained. Alistair answered before she could react. "She has been instructed by the royal seal to attend the selection process." The council exchanged uneasy glances. "And what qualifies her?" another asked. Alistair's response was simple. "That is what you will determine." Beatrice felt something tighten inside her chest, not because of fear alone, but because she realized something important. She was not being invited into safety. She was being placed into examination. And somewhere inside this palace, someone already knew more about her than she did. When the meeting ended, Alistair walked with her back toward the guest wing. "You did not defend me," she said quietly. "I did not need to. That council will decide whether I belong here or not." "No," he replied. "They will try, but they are not the final authority." Beatrice frowned slightly. "Then who is?" The Duke stopped walking for a brief moment. "The truth behind your mother's name." She froze. "My mother again," she whispered. "Yes," he said, "and what she was involved in before you were born." Beatrice felt the weight of that sentence settle deeply inside her, heavier than all the judgment she had faced so far. As they reached her chamber door, he added one final line. "Tomorrow the selection begins, and by then, the palace will no longer be able to pretend you are invisible." The door closed softly behind her, and for the first time since the funeral, Beatrice Whitcombe understood clearly that her life was no longer her own to remain hidden. That night, sleep did not come easily. Beatrice sat by the window long after the palace lights dimmed, watching guards change posts in silent rhythm. Each movement below reminded her that this place never truly rested. It only waited. A soft knock broke the stillness. She opened the door slightly to find the same attendant from earlier. "There is a message," the girl whispered, handing over a sealed note without meeting her eyes. Beatrice closed the door again and broke the seal carefully. The message contained only a few lines. "Do not trust the council. Do not trust your family. And do not assume the Duke is telling you everything." Her hands trembled slightly. Before she could think further, another sound came from the corridor outside her chamber. Not footsteps meant for her door, but quiet movement that stopped just before reaching it. Beatrice held her breath. A shadow paused briefly near the threshold, then moved away without a sound. She waited until silence returned before stepping back from the door. Across the palace, in a chamber lit by pale candlelight, Duke Alistair stood alone studying an old sealed document. The wax mark on it was worn but still visible, bearing a symbol connected to Beatrice's mother's name. He did not open it yet. Instead, he spoke quietly to himself. "Then it begins sooner than I expected." Outside, the palace remained still, but beneath its silence something had already shifted. Beatrice was no longer just a guest in the selection process. She had become the center of attention that even hidden hands could not ignore. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, someone who once knew her mother's secret was already aware that Beatrice Whitcombe had arrived. Beatrice pressed the note against her chest as if it could steady her thoughts, but it only deepened the unease inside her. The palace felt different now, less like a place of judgment and more like a place holding its breath. Somewhere in its long corridors, decisions were already forming without her voice. She looked once more toward the dark window, wondering how many lives had already been shaped by secrets like hers. Tomorrow will not be simple. It would be the first moment the court tried to define her fully. And she would have no choice but to stand and be seen alone now. The morning of the selection began with a silence that felt heavier than the ceremony. Beatrice stood before a tall mirror in the guest chamber, not admiring her reflection, but studying how unfamiliar she looked inside palace walls. Her hair had been arranged neatly by attendants who spoke little, their hands quick and precise, as though preparing her was a task they wished to finish without memory. A knock came. A steward entered without waiting for permission. "The selection review begins in the grand hall," he announced. Beatrice nodded once and followed. As she walked through the corridor, she noticed how the palace seemed more awake than the previous day. Doors were open, nobles moved with intention, and conversations carried a sharper edge. Everything here felt like preparation for judgment. At the entrance of the grand hall, Duke Alistair Norwyn stood waiting. "You slept?" he asked quietly. "Not much," she answered. "That is expected." She glanced at him. "Do they always treat people like this before deciding their value?" His expression remained steady, only when value is uncertain. Inside the hall, rows of nobles had already gathered. At the center stood a raised platform with sealed documents placed neatly on a table. Beatrice felt her steps slow slightly as she entered. Whispers rose instantly. "That is her. She looks too ordinary for this attention. Why would the Duke bring her here?" Beatrice kept her gaze forward, though every word pressed against her like invisible weight. Lord Harrowen stood near the platform, flanked by council members. His eyes tracked her arrival carefully. "So the unexpected participant finally arrives," he said. Alistair stepped slightly forward. "Begin the review." Harrowen gestured toward Beatrice. "Before we begin, the council must confirm identity and eligibility." A clerk approached with a ledger. "Beatrice Whitcombe, daughter of Helena Whitcombe, deceased. No recorded court attendance. No noble training." Murmurs followed the reading. One noble leaned forward. "Then why is she here?" Beatrice spoke before hesitation could stop her. "I was told I am here because the crown requested it." Harrowen studied her. "And you believe that is enough reason?" "I do not believe anything yet," she replied honestly. "I am still waiting for someone to explain it properly." A faint pause spread across the hall. Alistair's gaze shifted briefly toward her, then back to the council. "Proceed," he said. The review began with other candidates first. Noble daughters presented themselves with rehearsed posture and practiced answers. Each one spoke of lineage, loyalty, and court readiness. Beatrice observed quietly from her place at the side. With every introduction, she noticed something subtle. The council evaluated them quickly, almost mechanically, as if they already knew the outcome they wanted. When her turn finally came, the hall quieted. Harrowen spoke. "Step forward." Beatrice moved to the center. The silence around her felt different now. Less judgmental, more curious. "State your purpose," he said. She paused briefly. "I was brought here without understanding the reason. I have no training for court life, no preparation for selection. I am only here because I was told I must be." A noble woman whispered, "She admits weakness openly." Another replied, "Or she has nothing to hide." Harrowen tilted his head slightly. "And what do you offer the court?" Beatrice hesitated. This was the question no one had ever asked her in her own home. "I do not know yet," she said honestly. "But I believe value is not always proven by preparation alone. Sometimes it is revealed when people stop deciding who you are before you speak." A low murmur spread through the hall. Alistair did not react, but his eyes remained fixed on her. Harrowen stepped closer. Interesting answer, but incomplete. Before Beatrice could respond, a second voice interrupted from the side of the hall. "You are wasting time entertaining this." Lady Millicent had arrived. Beatrice turned slightly, surprised by her presence. Millicent approached with controlled composure. "This girl is not suited for court examination. Her presence here insults those who have trained their entire lives." Harrowen looked at her briefly. "Your opinion is noted." "I am her guardian," Millicent insisted. "I demand her removal from this process." Attention spread quickly. Alistair finally spoke. "You are not her guardian in legal terms." Millicent stiffened. "Excuse me? The documents left by her mother revoke your authority over her decisions," he said calmly. Gasps moved through the hall. Beatrice turned sharply toward him. You knew this already. Yes, he answered. And you did not tell me. Not yet. Harrowen raised a hand. Enough. The council must proceed with clarity. He turned toward Beatrice again. Last question before we deliberate. Why do you think you were chosen? Beatrice felt the weight of the hall pressing in. I think I was not chosen, she said slowly. I think I was placed here for a reason I do not understand yet. Silence followed. Then Harrowen nodded slightly. Take her away. Beatrice froze. What? For observation, he clarified, until we determine whether your presence is political disruption or genuine eligibility. Before she could protest, 2 attendants stepped forward. Alistair moved instantly. She will not be detained, he said firmly. Harrowen met his gaze. Then you risk violating protocol. I will take responsibility for her presence, Alistair replied. Beatrice looked between them, confused and unsettled. Finally, Harrowen nodded once. Very well. But understand this. The council does not tolerate uncertainty for long. The attendant stepped back. Beatrice was escorted out of the hall, but Alistair followed close behind. Once outside, she turned sharply. Why are you protecting me? He paused. Because removing you now would confirm their suspicion that you matter more than they admit. That is not an answer, she said quietly. It is the only one that holds weight here. She exhaled slowly, frustration mixing with confusion. Everyone speaks of me like I am already part of something I cannot see. You are, he said simply. They walked down a quieter corridor away from the hall. Servants passed, but avoided looking at them. Beatrice lowered her voice. My mother is at the center of this, isn't she? Alistair did not deny it. She was involved in decisions that reached beyond her household, he said carefully. Decisions the court never fully explained. Beatrice stopped walking. You keep saying that, she said, but no one tells me what she actually did. Alistair turned slightly toward her. Because if you know too soon, you will not survive what comes next. The honesty in his tone unsettled her more than secrecy. A distant bell rang through the palace, signaling the end of the initial review. Alistair began walking again. The council will deliberate tonight. And tomorrow? She asked. Tomorrow, he said. You will face them again, and this time they will not treat you as invisible. Beatrice followed in silence, but inside her, uncertainty had begun to shift into something sharper. Not fear alone, but the growing awareness that her life before the funeral had been built on hidden foundations. And somewhere inside the palace, those foundations were beginning to crack. Rain fell lightly over Belminster Palace the following evening as nobles gathered once more beneath towering chandeliers for the final selection banquet. The grand hall glowed with candlelight reflected against polished marble floors while musicians played softly near the gallery balcony. Yet beneath the beauty of the evening, tension moved through the room like an invisible current. Beatrice felt it immediately the moment she entered beside Duke Alistair Norwyn. Conversations slowed. Eyes followed them, not with curiosity anymore, with calculation. The nobles who had mocked her during the first review no longer looked entirely certain of themselves. Some whispered behind folded fans while others studied her carefully as though trying to understand why the Duke continued, allowing her beside him despite growing disapproval from the court. Lady Millicent stood near the center of the hall, with Percival and Lenora beside her. The moment she noticed Beatrice entering beside Alistair, her expression hardened. She is still here, Lenora muttered bitterly. She will not remain for long, Millicent answered quietly. But for the first time since the funeral, Beatrice no longer lowered her eyes beneath their judgment. She walked forward calmly, though her heartbeat remained uneven beneath the pressure surrounding her. At the far end of the hall, Lord Harrowan addressed the gathering. "Tonight concludes the royal selection proceedings," he announced. "Before this court, and under the authority of the crown, Duke Norwyn will present the woman he believes worthy of standing beside him before the kingdom." The room stirred instantly. Several noble daughters straightened with expectation. Others exchanged nervous glances. Beatrice remained still. She did not belong here. At least that was what she had been told her entire life. A servant approached carrying silver goblets, while another opened the towering doors leading toward the inner gallery, where the final presentation would occur later that evening. Alistair leaned slightly toward Beatrice. "Remain close tonight," he said quietly. She glanced at him. "You say that as though something dangerous is about to happen." His expression remained unreadable. Something dangerous has already begun. Before she could question him further, Lady Millicent approached with graceful urgency. "Your Grace," she said sweetly, "might I request a private word regarding my niece?" Beatrice immediately recognized the false warmth in her tone. Alistair's eyes cooled slightly. "You may speak here." Millicent forced a smile. "Surely family matters deserve discretion." "Not when discretion has already harmed her enough." The words landed sharply. Several nearby nobles pretended not to listen while clearly listening to every syllable. Millicent lowered her voice. "You are damaging this family's standings by continuing this spectacle." Beatrice answered before Alistair could speak. "My humiliation never troubled the family standing before now." Millicent's composure faltered slightly. "You are becoming insolent." "No," Beatrice replied softly. "I am becoming visible." Silence followed. Even Alistair's attention shifted toward her more fully after that answer. Millicent stepped closer. "You truly believe this Duke intends to protect you once tonight ends?" Beatrice held her gaze steadily. "I believe he has shown me more respect in 3 days than this family has shown me in years." The older woman's face tightened instantly. Before another argument could begin, musicians suddenly stopped playing. Every head turned toward the staircase above the hall. The royal chamberlain appeared. The crown requests the beginning of the final presentation. A wave of anticipation swept through the gathering. Noble daughters adjusted their posture while whispers spread rapidly through the ballroom. Beatrice felt tension tighten inside her chest again. Alistair offered only one quiet sentence before walking forward. "Do not let them decide your worth tonight." The hall slowly divided as guests moved toward the gallery chamber beyond the ballroom. Rows of velvet chairs surrounded a raised platform beneath enormous crystal chandeliers, while royal guards remained stationed along the walls. Beatrice sat near the back at first, hoping distance might lessen attention. It did not. Every glance still found her. Percival moved beside Lord Harrowan near the front, speaking in low tones that clearly carried frustration. Lenora watched Beatrice constantly with narrowed eyes, while Millicent remained stiff with contained anger. The chamberlain stepped forward once more. "By royal decree, the Duke of Norwyn shall now declare before witnesses the woman he chooses to stand beside him in title, duty, and public honor." A hush consumed the room completely. One by one, noble daughters were presented forward briefly. Their names, family histories, and accomplishments echoed through the chamber with practiced elegance. Beatrice barely listened. Her thoughts remained trapped elsewhere. Why had Alistair brought her here? Why had he defended her repeatedly? And why did the entire palace react, as though her existence threatened carefully balanced plans? The final candidate stepped away. Then silence returned. Lord Harrowan looked toward Alistair. "Your Grace," he announced, "the court awaits your decision." Alistair rose slowly from his seat. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Even the servants seemed to stop breathing. The Duke stepped toward the center platform with calm control, while every eye followed him. Candlelight reflected sharply against polished marble as he turned to face the gathering. "For years," he began evenly, "this court has mistaken performance for character." A murmur moved through the room. He continued. "Many standing here were raised to appear suitable beneath chandeliers, while never learning how to remain loyal when kindness offered no reward." Several nobles exchanged uncomfortable glances. Millicent's expression tightened further. Alistair's gaze moved slowly across the chamber before finally settling on Beatrice. "At a funeral," he said quietly, "I watched an entire room reduce one grieving daughter to ridicule while she alone mourned sincerely." The silence deepened. Beatrice felt her chest tighten painfully. No one moved, no one spoke. The Duke descended from the platform steps and walked directly through the chamber toward her. Whispers erupted instantly. "He cannot mean. Surely not her. This is madness." Beatrice remained frozen in place as Alistair stopped before her chair. Then, before the entire court and every noble gathered beneath the royal ceiling, the Duke of Norwyn extended his hand toward the woman they had called worthless. "I choose Beatrice Whitcombe." Shock crashed through the chamber. Lenora gasped aloud. Percival stood abruptly. Millicent's face drained of color so quickly she nearly lost balance. Lord Harrowan himself looked genuinely stunned for the first time since Beatrice arrived at the palace. The whispers became chaos. "She has no standing. She was mocked at her mother's funeral only days ago. How could the Duke possibly choose her?" Beatrice stared at Alistair, unable to breathe properly. "You cannot mean this," she whispered. "I do," he answered calmly. The chamberlain stepped forward uncertainly. "Your Grace, the court requires confirmation before witnesses." Alistair never looked away from Beatrice. "You have it!" The room erupted again. Millicent moved forward desperately. "This is absurd. She is inexperienced, emotional, and entirely unfit for court life." Alistair finally turned toward her. "And yet she possesses more dignity than those who spent years trying to break her." The words silenced the older woman instantly. Percival stepped forward next, anger visible beneath his composure. "You would humiliate established families for this girl?" Alistair's expression hardened. "No, your family accomplished its own humiliation without assistance from me." Several nobles lowered their eyes immediately. Beatrice could barely process the moment unfolding around her. Days ago, she had stood beside her mother's coffin while relatives called her worthless before strangers. Now the most powerful duke in the kingdom stood before the court publicly choosing her, while those same relatives watched in stunned silence. Her throat tightened painfully. "Why?" she asked softly. The hall quieted again to hear his answer. Alistair looked directly at her. "Because you remained kind when cruelty would have been easier. Because you endured humiliation without becoming cruel yourself. And because this court needed reminding that worth is not decided by the loudest voices in a room." No one interrupted him. No one dared. Beatrice felt emotion rise sharply inside her chest. Not from romance alone, but from something deeper and more unfamiliar. For the first time in years, someone had seen her clearly without treating her like a burden. Lord Harrowan slowly stepped forward after a long silence. "Then the declaration is witnessed," he announced carefully. "Before the court and under royal authority, Duke Alistair Norwyn has formally chosen Beatrice Whitcombe." The words echoed through the chamber like the closing of one life and the beginning of another. And across the room, Lady Millicent finally understood something too late. The girl they mocked at her mother's funeral would never again stand beneath their cruelty unnoticed. The silence after Duke Alistair Norwyn's declaration did not feel temporary. It felt permanent, as though the entire court understood that something irreversible had just happened before their eyes. Beatrice remained standing where he had chosen her, her heartbeat uneven, beneath the weight of hundreds of stunned expressions surrounding them. The chandeliers above continued glowing softly while whispers spread through the chamber like restless wind. Yet everything around her felt strangely distant. Only one thing remained clear. The same people who had called her worthless at her mother's funeral now stared at her as though they no longer recognized the girl they once dismissed so easily. Lord Harrowen finally raised his hand for silence. "The declaration has been witnessed," he announced carefully. "The court will honor the Duke's decision." Several nobles looked displeased by those words, but none interrupted him, because nobody challenged Duke Norwyn openly unless they wished to lose. Lady Millicent stood frozen near the front row, struggling to recover the control she had carried so confidently only days earlier. Percival looked furious enough to speak recklessly, while Lenora avoided looking at Beatrice altogether. Alistair lowered his hand slowly after helping Beatrice rise from her chair. "You should sit," she whispered unevenly. "Everyone is watching." "They were watching long before tonight," he replied calmly. The honesty of that answer settled deeply inside her. Musicians resumed playing softly, though the atmosphere never fully recovered from the shock of the announcement. Groups of nobles immediately gathered into private conversations, while servants moved carefully through the room, pretending not to listen. Beatrice felt overwhelmed by it all. "You look pale," Alistair observed quietly. "I was called worthless 3 days ago, beside my mother's coffin," she answered softly. "Now an entire court is staring at me because you chose me before the kingdom. I do not think my thoughts have caught up yet." Something gentler appeared briefly in his expression. "They will." Before she could answer, Lord Harrowen approached them again. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "the Crown requests your attendance in the private council chamber before midnight." Alistair nodded once, understood. Harrowen then looked toward Beatrice with far more caution than before. "Miss Whitcombe," he added, "there are many in this court who will question tonight's decision." "I expected that," she replied quietly. "But there are also many," he continued, "who now wish they had treated you differently." The words carried an uncomfortable truth, because already several nobles who had ignored or mocked her earlier were suddenly offering respectful nods as they passed nearby. Beatrice noticed every one of them, not because she enjoyed it, because it revealed how quickly respect changed when power entered the room. As the evening continued, noble guests approached carefully one after another, introducing themselves with polished manners that had been completely absent only yesterday. Lady Rowena Hartley bowed her head slightly. "Miss Whitcombe, congratulations on your selection." A lord beside her added, "The Duke's judgment has always been respected." Beatrice answered politely, though part of her still remembered how these same people had watched silently while she was humiliated during the earlier review. Nothing about them had changed overnight, only her position had. Across the ballroom, Millicent watched every interaction with growing bitterness. Finally, unable to contain herself longer, she crossed the room toward Beatrice directly. "You seem very comfortable suddenly," she said in a controlled voice. Beatrice met her gaze calmly. "No, I simply no longer feel invisible." Millicent stepped closer. "Do not mistake temporary attention for permanent security. Before Beatrice could answer, Alistair appeared beside her once again. "You continue speaking to her as though she still belongs beneath your control," he said evenly. Millicent stiffened. "I raised her after her father's death." "You diminished her after her father's death," he corrected. Several nearby nobles immediately pretended not to hear. Millicent's composure finally cracked. "You know nothing about what this family sacrificed." Alistair's eyes hardened slightly. "I know enough to recognize cruelty when I witness it." The older woman fell silent. For the first time in years, someone had spoken to Millicent without fear of her authority. And the humiliation showed clearly across her face. Beatrice watched quietly, emotions twisting painfully inside her chest. Part of her had spent years hoping for this moment, hoping someone would finally defend her openly. Yet standing here now, she felt no triumph, only exhaustion. Later that evening, after many guests had departed, Beatrice stepped alone onto the palace terrace, overlooking the moonlit gardens. Cool night air brushed against her face, while distant carriage wheels echoed below the palace steps. Everything had changed too quickly. Footsteps approached behind her. She did not need to turn to know it was Alistair. "You escaped the ballroom," he observed. "So did you." He stepped beside her near the terrace railing. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Beatrice finally asked the question that had remained inside her since the funeral. "Why me?" Alistair looked toward the dark gardens below before answering. "Because when I entered that chapel, everyone else was thinking about inheritance, status, or appearance." He paused briefly. "You were the only person grieving honestly." Beatrice swallowed hard. "That cannot be enough reason for all of this." "It was enough reason for me to notice you." The quiet sincerity in his voice unsettled her more than grand declarations ever could. She looked down at her hands. "I still feel like the same girl they mocked." "You are," he said calmly. "The difference is that now the room is finally being forced to see you clearly." Silence settled gently between them. Not uncomfortable, not cold, just still. After a moment, Beatrice spoke again. "When my mother died, I thought my life had ended with hers." Her voice softened slightly. "At the funeral, hearing my own family call me worthless before strangers, I believed them for a moment." Alistair turned fully toward her then. "And now?" Beatrice looked out across the gardens. "Now I think people become cruel when they fear someone surviving without their permission." A faint trace of admiration crossed his expression. "You learn quickly. I had no choice." From inside the palace, distant music continued drifting through open windows, while servants prepared the final carriages for departing nobles. But out on the terrace, the world suddenly felt quieter than it had in days. Then hurried footsteps interrupted the calm. A palace servant approached quickly, bowing with urgency. "Your Grace," "Forgive the interruption, but there is trouble in the lower hall." Alistair's expression sharpened instantly. "What happened?" The servant hesitated. "Lord Percival Whitcombe has been arguing with members of the Royal Council. He claims the selection was manipulated and demands formal review." Beatrice closed her eyes briefly. Of course he would not let it end peacefully. Alistair's voice remained calm. "Take Miss Whitcombe back inside." "No," Beatrice said immediately. Both men looked at her. She straightened slowly. "I spent years remaining silent while others spoke over me. I will not hide tonight." The servant stepped aside uncertainly. Alistair studied her for a moment before nodding once. "Very well." When they entered the lower hall, raised voices echoed through the corridor. Percival stood near the council chamber surrounded by several nobles, while Lenora desperately tried calming him. "This selection damages respected families for the sake of sentiment." Percival argued angrily. My cousin has no experience, no standing, and no right to stand above women properly raised for this role. The moment he noticed Beatrice entering beside Alistair, his expression darkened further. There she is, he snapped. The entire kingdom is suddenly pretending she matters. Beatrice felt every eye shift toward her again, but this time, something inside her remained steady. She walked forward, slowly until standing directly before her cousin. For years, she said quietly, I believed there was something wrong with me because this family treated me as though I carried shame simply by existing. Percival scoffed bitterly. You were weak. No, Beatrice answered calmly. I was alone. The corridor fell silent. She continued before fear could return. You called me worthless beside my mother's coffin before strangers. Yet even then, all I had done was grieve honestly, while the rest of you fought over status and inheritance. Lenora lowered her eyes immediately. Millicent, who had arrived moments earlier, remained completely silent. Beatrice looked around at all of them. I do not hate you, she said softly, but I will never again believe your cruelty defines my value. The words settled through the hall with quiet finality. No dramatic shouting followed. No defense came quickly enough, because deep down, everyone present knew she was telling the truth. Alistair stepped beside her once more. The matter is finished, he announced firmly, and this time nobody argued. The palace corridors gradually emptied afterward, until only silence remained beneath the candlelit ceilings. As dawn slowly approached beyond the tall windows of Belminster Palace, Beatrice stood beside the man who had chosen her before the kingdom and realized something she never thought possible. The girl they once called worthless had survived long enough to become impossible to ignore. Do you think the Duke chose her because of her mother's hidden past? Or because he saw something in her no one else ever noticed? If you were in her place, would you trust a man who changed your life overnight in front of an entire kingdom? Was this truly her rise into power, or the beginning of an even deeper truth the palace is still hiding? And most importantly, what do you think will happen when the kingdom realizes she is no longer the girl they once called worthless? Drop your answer in the comments. I'll be responding to each.